The Message with Muscavich and Murphy is a weekly 2-hour radio program coming to you from the studios of WCDB Albany 90.9 FM. You can catch Nick and I every Monday from 6 to 8 p.m. for our live broadcast or through our YouTube channel, where we give you bonus podcast time, extended interviews, and much, much more. And our fate and theme is Oceans. It's produced by a great friend of the show, Marsh Sound. So enjoy.
So Patrick's sitting in on our show right now because our guest Matthew VanDyke is going to be calling in about 5 or 6 minutes, and Patrick actually watched the documentary Point and Shoot, which was a documentary made about Matthew VanDyke's life that we all watched over this weekend, so we know a little bit more about this guy who is going to be calling in. He's been all over Africa, honestly. He's been all over Africa. He's been featured on news stations like Fox and CNN and BBC. I think the documentary was by BBC.
And his local Baltimore ABC.
He's from Baltimore, Maryland.
Yeah, we should give a little bit of background on him. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And then, at UMBC, he started to study the Arab world. And then he later studied in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service from 2002 to 2004. And then he received his master's degree in Security Studies with a Middle East regional concentration in 2004.
Yep. So, and his documentary, the documentary about him, it kind of explained that he's from a single. His mother's a single child who was from a single child, and he's a single child, and an only child. And it was kind of talking about how he never really fit in with kids growing up, and he felt like he needed to fulfill something almost, and he decided to travel around North Africa, and then he decided to start making documentaries because he was inspired by what was that Australian?
I think it was Albie Mengels. I'm pretty sure it was. Yeah.
He was kind of like a forerunner to, or more of like an anthropological Steve Irwin.
Yeah, a little. Figure. Yeah, he was an Australian filmmaker of World Safari fame, and then interesting thing about VanDyke is that he wrote a political column for his campus newspaper at Georgetown.
I think he was also on the radio,
and he co-hosted a radio talk show on the Georgetown University radio station WGTB.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about all this stuff with him just to get a little bit more of a background and then bring you up to date with what he's doing now, which is, I think, Sons of Liberty.
Yep. And he's supposed to be calling in about 5 minutes, so just a little bit more background on him, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll be doing like a sort of roundtable thing since all of us are here, Connor and I, and then our kind of de facto correspondent.
Yeah. Well, I think we've overlooked some of the more... not to give anything away, but some of the more harrowing things that happened. He was held in Libya for 5.5 years in solitary 5.5 months. 5.5 months in solitary confinement. He kind of straddles this border between journalist and participant in conflict. He's definitely guided by a certain moral vision that I hope we can be able to discuss with him.
And it's interesting because he doesn't consider himself a journalist. I said that to him in an email before he agreed to come on the show. I was like, we'll probably be asking you questions about, your bridge between journalism and fighting. And he said, I'm not really a journalist. I just get tired of correcting the media, telling them that I'm not. So he just kind of, he doesn't consider himself to be part of the Fourth Estate, which is interesting because he's a documentary filmmaker.
But the fact remains, he is, in addition to fighting, he is in the business of transmitting facts.
He won the Tribeca Film Award for
Best Documentary.
Best Documentary. It was a short film called, what is it called? It's the Syrian film.
Not Anymore, a story of revolution. And that's about...
which we also watched last night, which was just horrific.
Yeah, it's a short 15-minute... It's a short 15-minute documentary, about Aleppo and about Bashar al-Assad's regime over there, especially in a time when... well, actually, you could just see it on film. There's horrific explosions and bombings happening in his film and people dying. It's just very very graphic, but very telling of the kind of world that Matthew VanDyke lives. And also with a bit of uplift, like you see some of the what you might see in America is the elusive moderate Syrian rebels, like a woman who had suffered so much loss and persisted in her campaign against Assad. She was FSA, she was Free Syrian Army. And that it was really kind of a portrait of her about how you think when you think about the uprising, the Civil War, you think kind of dusty men. Yeah, but there was this very, very strong woman. Yeah, with a flak jacket and a helmet, and she was sort of a documentarian too. It was kind of like VanDyke was documenting the actual Civil War there. And there's this one quote by her where she was talking about women in war. I think she was saying, she said, "I don't want to die cheap like so many women have before," and that is in the kitchen or in the washroom doing something.
Yeah, she was domestic. A former English professor. Yeah, not English professor, English teacher at the high school. And it's interesting because Matthew VanDyke is witnessing these events happening first-handedly, and the documentary about him is called Point and Shoot, which I think is a pretty cool double entendre, where point and shooting a camera, but he's also picking up a gun and pointing and shooting a gun. Yeah, and that was directed by two-time Academy Award nominee Marshall Curry. And we'll ask him what that was like, that experience working along an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Yeah, definitely. He's going to be calling in any minute now, and that should be a really interesting interview. So if you're not tuned in, or if you know a friend that's not tuned in, tell him to tune in. Anything else to add to his background, Patrick? Or nothing except that I feel a kind of kinship with him. I'm an only child that felt like he didn't fit in and has been drawn to the Middle East. Aside from that, we don't have a ton in common. But I totally, when they described his early life, I totally kind of got it, especially because he was very close with his grandparents, as am I. Yeah. No, he had an interesting upbringing. He, I think he fancied himself a fan of action movies. And he was a big fan of Lawrence of Arabia, which is just like, it's a fabulous movie. And it's a great movie because it's not Orientalist. Like, the movie really... and I think he's calling in right now. Hello, Matt. You ready to go on air? Alrighty, I'm putting you on right now. Hey, Matthew VanDyke, how are you doing? This is Nick Miscavige right now.
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. We're joined right now by my co-host. This is Connor Murphy, and then kind of a correspondent for the show, Patrick Tine, a student journalist here at University at Albany, and we're going to kind of do like a little roundtable discussion, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
So what have you been up to, Matt?
I just returned from Iraq for meetings with some militia leaders.
Which militia leaders?
I can't say which ones. We're kind of keeping that low key right now until we have programs set up with them, and there's a lot of different factors going on in their internal political conflicts, so we don't want to disrupt any of that.
Yeah, okay. So I think we're going to start out with like a little bit of a background on you. You went to Georgetown University, and I think you were actually involved with your student radio there. What kind of show did you host back then?
I was kind of a third host that would come on, but sort of more of a guest, really. It was a political talk show. They actually had a conservative liberal, and then I was brought in to talk international topics.
Oh, okay. Because you studied that kind of stuff, right, in college?
Yes. Yeah.
What do you think drew you to the Arab world at large?
It could have been any number of factors, but I took some courses when I was in undergrad at University of Maryland, Baltimore County at UMBC, and had a good professor, Dr. Lou Cantori, and really got an interest in the region from him.
Yeah, so we watched the documentary about you called Point and Shoot, and we saw that when you were growing up, you were very influenced by Albie Mangles, who was an Australian filmmaker and was in World Safari. Were you always interested in action films like that, and is that kind of what inspired you when you rode your motorcycle around northern Africa? And I guess kind of the segue to that, what was that experience like?
Well, yes, Albie Mengel's documentary work was really what motivated me to set off on a motorcycle from North Africa to the Middle East. I was really inspired by his films, and I realized through the power of his film that perhaps it was possible to inspire others to pursue their dreams. So I set out to make a film kind of in the spirit of his work, and spent about 4 years by motorcycle, traveling, making contacts, and seeing the world for myself.
And just to kind of reiterate that, in that film, it kind of came out that you mentioned it a couple times. You suffer from a case of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. What was that like, making a film and suffering from a disease like that?
It certainly made it more difficult, especially in third world countries where it's not particularly clean. But it did make things probably 5 times harder than they otherwise would have been.
Yeah, okay. And then you also had a girlfriend back at home at that same time. How was that, going away to another continent for, years on end? How was that strain between your guys' relationship?
Well, when I met her, I was at the beginning of my travels. We actually met in Spain, where I shipped a motorcycle over to, so she sort of knew what she was getting into to an extent. But I would come back from time to time, and she came over once to Egypt to see me. So it worked out okay. And
Egypt was one of the countries that you visited when you were on that motorcycle trip. And what were the other countries that you actually rode into?
Morocco, Mauritania, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan.
What was Mauritania like? For our listeners who might not know, Mauritania was the last country in the world to officially outlaw slavery, but the practice is still fairly widespread and common in the country, and it's kind of one of the most overlooked places and in the most overlooked continent. But do you have any standout recollections of Mauritania?
Mauritania was sort of where I learned to toughen up a lot. It was the worst place I had been to until I went to Afghanistan 2 years after that. I had problems there with things getting stolen. I had problems with my motorcycle breaking down in the desert. It was a very, very harsh place, and not just the climate, but hard socially and culturally to deal with. I had actually got involved in a car smuggling operation, taking cars from Morocco down to Mauritania, and eventually with plans taking them to Bali, and I had 2 cars stolen in the no man's land between the 2 countries. The Mauritanians had shut down their border, and you had to pay other smugglers to smuggle them through the minefields, and my business partner trusted the wrong person over my objections.
Oh my goodness.
So that didn't go well. Mauritania was very, very tough for me. But, I got through it, and it really toughened me up before the rest of the journey.
Now, you call these travels a crash course in manhood. Why do you think you call it that?
Well, I don't really call it that. That was something from the film. There's a lot of things in the film that were taken, minor things or things I kind of said off the cuff that were turned into something much bigger by the director than they really were, and some scripted lines and things in that film. I have a lot of issues with point and shoot, but the origin of me just saying that was, after I had completed the journey, I looked back on it in 2010, I realized that I had grown a lot, learned a lot, and it was perhaps part of it was an emergence into adulthood.
Well, to go off of that, kind of that misclassification where they reiterated that it was a crash course on manhood, you kind of said the same kind of thing to me in an email about you being classified as a journalist, and you don't really see yourself fit in that classification of being part of the Fourth Estate. What is that like to be constantly referred to in the media as being part of the media? And what do you classify yourself as, I guess I should ask?
I mean, now it's not as much a problem because I'm in military contracting. When I was a filmmaker, some people don't know the difference between journalists and documentary filmmaking. There's a very big difference. A lot of it stems from when I was missing in Libya. I was a prisoner of war. A journalist referred to me as a journalist when I was missing, and then other journalists copied that label. But it's incredibly frustrating. I mean, it's something that doesn't do journalists any good. It doesn't do me any good. It's really a struggle to make sure that everything reported is accurate. and you'd be surprised how much isn't.
And you just kind of touched on it, and you mentioned you being a prisoner of war in Libya, and that was when you were fighting with the rebels against Gaddafi's regime. Do you want to explain a little bit how you got involved with that, and exactly what kind of, how was an experience like being held as a prisoner of war for months upon months? What was that like for your mental psyche?
Well, in 2008, I had been in Libya for about 6 weeks. I made really good friends there and had kept in touch with them over the years. When the revolution started 3 years later, and I was talking to those friends about what was happening, they had neighbors being killed, relatives being arrested. I realized I couldn't just sit at home and do nothing. It looked like the international community was not going to get involved at that time, and I set off to go help and join the revolution. I was there and serving in the revolution and captured before NATO got involved, and spent nearly 6 months as a prisoner of war. And nobody knew if I was dead or alive. My family had no idea what had happened to me. The Gaddafi government denied having me for almost that entire time. I was in solitary confinement, which is a form of psychological torture. No books to read, nothing to do, nobody to talk to for about half a year, just staring at the wall. And then one day, prisoners came to my cell, broke the lock off, and we escaped prison. And then I returned to combat on the front lines.
Now, there was a part in that film which you pretty much just described, how it was psychological torture. It was a very surreal scene. How do you think Marshall Curry, the director of Point and Shoot, handled that scene? Do you think he handled it appropriately by using animation?
The animation's probably the best part of the film. So some of the audio that was used is a mischaracterization of what my auditory hallucinations were like, but the animation's excellent. The cell did look a lot like that. I went back after escaping and after the war was over and took some photographs inside the cell. So the animation was recreated from those photographs. So the animation's quite accurate.
Wow.
Well, that's terrific. If we don't mind, we could change gears because we're so lucky to have a correspondent who's actually been, or a guest who's actually been to all these places. Do you have any kind of take on the region as it stands today with regard to, the two governments in Libya, bombing in Russia, entering the arena in Syria? Do you have any, where do you think it's headed? What do you make of it all?
Well, it looks like Iraq and Syria won't be put back together in the same form they are now. You'll probably end up with 2 or 3 countries coming out of each of those. Libya, I think, will eventually get it together. They sacrificed a lot. They bled a lot for that revolution. And they're very proud people and exceptional people. And I think they'll eventually work it out. Having 2 rival governments is better than having no government. So, I'm optimistic on Libya. Syria and Iraq, it's going to be a very long conflict. There's no unified ground force in either country that can really fight against ISIS. And the longer the conflict goes on, the greater the divisions are likely to become.
Do you think that the Turkish government is more concerned with preventing the emergence of a Kurdish state than they are with taking down ISIS?
Yes. Every player in this conflict is looking beyond ISIS. They all view the rise of ISIS as an opportunity, and they're all gaming for what happens after ISIS. So all the different sectarian groups, all the ethnic groups, each country is looking at when the pieces that are shifted around that are Iraq and Syria fall into place, which pieces they're going to have and how they can maneuver during this conflict to gain the largest share of territory, to gain the largest political advantage, and so on. And that's really what their eyes are on. Well, I see it when we work with local forces, with Sons of Liberty International, and we're training and advising local forces in Iraq. They want to fight ISIS, but at the same time, they are definitely looking at what happens after ISIS is gone.
Well, it's great that you mentioned your organization, Sons of Liberty. Before you said that you're now a military contractor, and so you're a military contractor with Sons of Liberty, or is that another project? Or you see yourself as like Sons of Liberty is a military contracting group?
Yes, Sons of Liberty is a military contracting group. But we differ in that we provide all of our services for free to clients that need them, and also provide some supplying and funding.
And what sort of people are you training in Sons of Liberty? Are they Kurds? Are they Catholics or Christians?
We've been working with the Assyrian community in Iraq, who are the original inhabitants of the country, going back to thousands of years back to the Assyrian Empire of antiquity. And it's a almost entirely Christian population these days. We've been working with them. We finished our work with one militia, begun talks with another militia, and might be supplying them with a few things soon. We've also been talking to other groups in Iraq. We haven't worked with the Kurds. The U.S. military is working with the Kurds, and there's not really a need for them to have our assistance. Our model is to step in where governments have failed, and we do this through the public making contributions. So people around the world from 20 different countries, though most of them are American, have gone to sonsoflibertyinternational.com and made a contribution. It allows us to recruit U.S. military veterans. We have nearly 1,000 applicants right now for positions to go over and provide free training to these local forces that desperately need it.
So are these veterans mainly from the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, or are they older guys who might be nearing retirement age, or what does your average Sons of Liberty combatant look like?
The average age we're looking at right now for the next training are 40s and 50s. We like guys that have retired from the service so that they're able to volunteer. We work on a volunteer model, so that allows us to bring the best trainers in the world. We get people that normally would make $700-800 a day in the military contracting world, but they're willing to come and volunteer for 2, 3, or 4 weeks to run a training program. It allows us to bring a level of talent that these groups would never have access to. And we have a preference for former special forces, and people who have expertise in various training fields. And our recent lead trainer used to be an instructor at West Point, for example.
Oh, really? Well, what do you think motivates them? Is it a desire to just kind of, they have kind of like a fighting, just a soldier's spirit, or is it just an overwhelming revulsion and hatred of the lavish violence you've been seeing from ISIS, or is it maybe a combination?
Well, a lot of our applicants are obviously opposed to ISIS. Some of them served in Iraq and view it as the job wasn't finished. Some of them want to help persecuted minorities, like the Christians of Iraq. Why somebody wants to join is a very important question. We tend to favor those who want to support minority groups and those who've suffered under ISIS and who want to do something about ISIS. But the older demographic that we're recruiting now are certainly not guys that are going for a lot of risk and adventurism and those sorts of nonsense things. I mean, these are guys that are very serious trainers, which is why they're the ones that we're really looking at for all future programs right now.
And how does military contracting work? Since you have your own organization, Sons of Liberty, do you have to go get certain licensing through the United States State Department or anything like that?
We're registered as a military contractor with the U.S. government, but we don't actually pursue contracts because we're working for free. So we're actually charting new territory in this field. And we have laws to abide by, but our model is very unconventional in the way that we're operating. So we do agreements with local forces on the ground. We don't do actual contracts because there's not an exchange of money, and if there is any exchange of supplies or money, it's from us going to the client. So it's really an innovative approach to security that we intend to replicate beyond just Iraq.
And how has the progress been for such an innovative approach to military contracting? How has it been going on the ground over there?
It's been very good. The response from the public for funding has been sufficient. The locals have been very receptive to it. I mean, these are groups that may have a battalion of 300 men and only have 2 pickup trucks and no body armor for any of them. They would never be able to get training if we didn't provide it, or if they did, they would get a couple weeks of really lackluster training from a national army in one of these countries. So they're very eager for the training. They're very eager for specialized training, like EOD training, to deal with explosives and booby traps left behind by ISIS. And the leadership of these militias. Some of these militias have just formed from this conflict, so they really have no clue what they're doing to begin with. Some of them have no military experience, and if they do, it's with the Iraqi army, which isn't a particularly good army these days. So they really rely heavily on our advising and counseling, and we're happy to provide it.
And you said you're working with groups that are predominantly Christian over there. Are you Christian yourself, and have you always been, or did you convert, or what are your views on that?
I've always been Christian. I'm privately religious, but not publicly, and okay. Our work doesn't really it's not motivated by religion. The Christians are a group that in Iraq that has been threatened on numerous levels, and that's who we're working with, but they're not the only group that we've been in talks with to work with in Iraq.
Okay, just to switch gears over to something you said about ISIS and about U.S. policy relating to them. You said something like paying them off for in exchange for hostages. Can you elaborate a little bit on this policy?
I don't recall. What are you referencing?
You said like on a television broadcast about the potential for a policy to pay off ISIS for in exchange for hostages.
Okay, paying money for hostages.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Instead of I don't know. I guess just leaving them to their fates.
One of the main arguments against paying money for hostages is that it helps fund the terrorist group that you're paying the money to, and it helps encourage them to take more hostages. ISIS and a lot of other terrorist groups have made it clear that they will take hostages regardless, especially if they're American. And in the case of ISIS, the economic argument doesn't particularly apply. ISIS has a more diversified economy than some of the governments in the Middle East. They have money coming from taxation. They have money coming from criminal activity. They have money coming from the sale of oil, the sale of weapons, the sale of antiquities that they dig up from historic sites. So really, the couple $1 million that they get for hostages in the context of the hundreds of millions of dollars that they have from, their illicit activities plus robbing banks and so on in territories that they occupy, it really makes no difference. I've seen two friends of mine, James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, and another friend of mine, John Cantley, who's still being held by ISIS, all victims of this group, and none of them had ransoms paid for them. The small cost to pay to get hostages back is certainly worth that cost.
What was it like hearing it must have been tragic, but, the news with Foley and Sotloff. Have you ever seen yourself, since you're fighting ISIS, up close and personal? Have you ever have you ever been in a situation where you felt like that could have been you in that situation?
Being captured is really the only thing I fear. I've been captured before. Part of the thing about being captured is sometimes you have no chance to even resist. In the case of Libya, it was an ambush. I suffered a head wound, and I was knocked unconscious and basically woke up in prison. So sometimes the fact that you can just be walking down the street in Syria or Iraq or anywhere and just suddenly wake up in prison is kind of a scary thought. I've certainly pictured myself in the situations of my friends, and I still go on just like they did. They knew the risks. I knew the risks, and we all do what we believe in.
Yeah, and that's that kind of reverberates with. We watched a little bit. Well, we watched your documentary, "Not Anymore: Story of Revolution," which took place in Aleppo, and that's kind of what that journalist there, that female journalist, and that fighter, the two main subjects of the documentary, were saying that they know the risk, but they got to keep going because there's some kind of hope there. And do you want to just update us with what happened to those two subjects of that documentary? What are they up to now?
Well, Noor, the female journalist, is still working as a photographer for Reuters. She won the International Women's Media Foundation Courage in Journalism Award. And the man in the film, Malia, unfortunately his FSA unit disbanded because they ran out of money. He had been personally funding a lot of that unit. And they ran out of money, and he had to go to Turkey, which is the sad story of a lot of moderate opposition units. They never got support, never got funding, and a lot of them dissolved, and members went to other units, or they left the revolution, or in some cases may have joined jihadist groups just for the opportunity to serve in the revolution, because only those groups had funding and supplies.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. That film was actually received quite well. I think it won the Tribeca Film Award Documentary of the Year, if I'm not mistaken.
That was Point and Shoot won the best documentary.
Oh, that was
award.
Point and Shoot?
But Not Anymore Story Revolution has done well in the festival circuit. It's won over 100 awards.
And are you working on any other films right now, or do you have your hands kind of tied up with this whole Sons of Liberty project?
Well, I left filmmaking after Point and Shoot. Things that went on in the post-production of that film really opened my eyes to a side of documentary filmmaking that I didn't like. So I'm a little disillusioned with the whole filmmaking.
And what was that side exactly?
Mostly things that went on with scripted audio and the way audio was manipulated and taking the answers of a question and inserting those answers after another question.
Yeah, kind of making it more dramatic in a way.
Well, and really just messing with the facts and what happened. And that's not how I make documentaries, but that's how the director chose to do it. And it really made me question the whole genre and what I see in other documentaries, how much of it's truly accurate and how much of it isn't. But maybe someday I'll go back to filmmaking. I have a lot of footage that I never used, but right now all of my effort is in Sons of Liberty International and will be for the foreseeable future. We're looking to expand to other countries in early next year and really take the project global.
Well, what about 7 Days in Syria? I think it had you listed on multiple movie websites as being involved with this. It's an upcoming film about Janine DiGiovanni. Can you elaborate on this film at all, or are you did you drop out of it, or what happened there?
No, I'm a producer and cinematographer on the film. My contribution to the film is largely in the form of footage that I shot in Syria that's being used in the film. Some footage from Not Anymore Story Revolution, a lot of footage that was shot during the time that wasn't used in my own film, and some on the production side. But that was really a project that's been going on a couple of years that now the film's coming out.
Yeah, so you said ideally you'd like to expand into other countries. Are you talking about other countries in the Middle East or other pockets of unrest around the world?
We've had invitations to come help local forces in Libya, Pakistan, Philippines, Nigeria, and Syria. Most likely, we're really focused on the fight against ISIS at this time. So other places in the Middle East and North Africa are really where our focus is going to be for at least the next year or two.
Now, do you think Assad's position is tenable? I mean, do you think do you think it will end with him ruling Syria, or will it end with him taking the midnight flight to Saudi Arabia, or will it end like Gaddafi, being ripped asunder by the people? How do you see? If we're even at the point of even possibly foreseeing an end game, given all the variables in that country, what do you see, and what would your ideal outcome be?
Assad's very likely to remain in power. It's just a question of how much of the country remains in power of. If the revolution's successful, he'll remain in control of Latakia for the most part and rule an Alawite state. If the revolution fails, he'll remain in control of Damascus, Aleppo, the whole west of the country, the south of the country, and the north and east of the country will be under revolution or Kurdish control. It's really impossible that he ever regains full control of that country. But serious damage was done to the revolution recently when Germany opened its borders to migrants, and a lot of fighters in the revolution saw another option out besides win or die and took it, and it really has undermined a lot of the revolution.
But you can't blame them, though. After fighting for so long.
Yes, I certainly can blame them.
Really?
Yes. What if the American revolutionaries, they fought for several years in the American Revolution, much longer, twice as long as this conflict's going on in Syria. What if they had just given up? You commit yourself to revolution and you see it through to the end. And you don't just cut and run and leave your comrades behind while you go seek a better life in Europe. And if you do go, you take your family to Europe and then you come back and continue serving. I have no understanding or sympathy for men who abandon their comrades and leave the revolution.
Well, just to transition again one more time, I think the story, it's been talked about quite a lot and it's back in the news again. And this is Hillary Clinton being put on a panel trials with the Benghazi incident, and you were actually used as a source in a story on Business Insider, like shortly after Benghazi happened in 2013. And I guess I'm just asking, what do you think about this story coming back into the mainstream news? Do you feel like it's kind of overshadowing some of the things that you've been not that you've been doing like out there, but like things that have been updates in Syria and Iraq? And also, how do you feel about Hillary Clinton's whole handling of the Benghazi incident?
I'm not really concerned about it overshadowing anything, but it is very unfortunate that, a tragedy that should have united Americans has been used as a political football to divide us, and now for years. I mean, this was an incident that happened in 2012. Here we are in 2015, right during election time, and now there's more hearings. It's really an abuse of the hearing system. It's not good for Congress. It's not good for America. It's not good for anything. And it wasn't good for the Republicans. I mean, Hillary Clinton had more contributions and will likely have a bump in the poll numbers after those hearings. There's no winners from these hearings, and they accomplish nothing in any understanding of what happened in Benghazi.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about a more recent revelation? Have you heard about these drone papers released by The Intercept?
No, I don't think so.
Well, tell them what they are.
Well, pretty much what happened was there was a Pentagon official or an insider in the State Department that released these documents that pretty much revealed all the different complexities of drone policy in America, right? That's going on right now, and there was a lot of like insider lingo leaked, the kind of process that government officials go about in performing these selected killings over in the Middle East, especially so. But yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting story. I think you would be especially interested in. I mean, I'm not sure, but...
And the issue with drones is nobody ever wants to put boots on the ground, but then they don't want drone strikes either. So the only other option is disengagement. I'm against the assassination of U.S. citizens on foreign soil, but otherwise dropping bombs on terrorists or authoritarian regimes, I'm completely okay with. It's far better than putting our guys on the ground to do it.
Would you say, in general, would you consider yourself like an interventionist? Like it's always better to do something, right? Rather than
I don't believe it's always better to do something, but in the cases of people fighting for their liberty, and we're a country that was born out of revolution, and we're a country that put a man on the moon in the 1960s, and here we are, in 2015, and there's hundreds of millions of people around the world living under authoritarian medieval regimes. There's no excuse for it. And I don't think we should just abandon these people to their fate. Did
you support the invasion of Iraq in 2003?
No, and I actually protested against it. It was kind of funny. At Georgetown, there was a group called Peace Action, an anti-war group, and I was in the anti-war group. However, I was the person in the anti-war group who wasn't for peace. And I favored a strategy of arming local forces and giving them air support, and would get into some arguments with people who are more peace inclined in the anti-war movement. Mm-hmm. Basically, the model that was eventually actually done in Libya was what I favored for Iraq. I wanted Saddam Hussein moved, but not with an occupation, because that would be a complete disaster in U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, anybody who'd said we'd be greeted as liberators, I mean, that's a childish thing to say. I mean, no time in history has an occupying force ever been greeted with anything less than suspicion, and usually more. So do you consider then how would you grade Obama's approach to handling international crises and incidents? Because he certainly isn't a neoconservative, but he certainly isn't a pacifist or a non-interventionist.
Right. Well, I mean, he is largely non-interventionist. I mean, we have the unfortunate situation of having had a president that was very foolish under Bush, followed by a president that was very cowardly under Obama. And I hope that people have learned now that you cannot take a non-interventionist approach when there's instability in the Middle East, in all of these conflicts, you get several months of time that you have to resolve the conflict, and if not, the jihadists start showing up from all over the world. And you saw in Libya, intervention, there were no jihadists during the war. The war lasted 8 months. They didn't have time to get there. Any that are there showed up after the war was over when there was still instability. But whenever a country's broken in the Middle East, you will have jihadists show up to try to take advantage of that instability. And in Syria, it was entirely predictable what was happening, what was going to happen, and what was happening. There were early signs of it. And really, Obama should take the blame for the rise of ISIS and for the continued instability in the region and for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people that could have been prevented if the U.S. had just, in the early days of the Syrian revolution, provided an air support, an air campaign. It would have led to defections from Assad's army that would have been enough to tilt the balance of power in favor of the revolution and wrap this thing up a couple of years ago.
Hey, Matthew, I think we're just about going to be wrapping it up right now. I guess just one more question, just to, since you were mentioning Libya. I'm sorry. Actually, I'm going back to your film in Syria. It kind of ended, it did end with that subject talking. They were both around that cat on the chair, and he decided to end it with this scene of them both standing next to this cat. And they kind of said this sobering thing where they were like, show America this video of this cat. We have cats here as well in Aleppo and in Syria. Maybe it will give them something to care about. Maybe they'll pay more attention to us out here. And I guess I'm just saying, what do you think could be done to educate people more about what's going on in these other countries?
I wish I knew. America is a very entertainment-oriented culture, and one that people's interests generally are not on international events until the consequences of those events come crashing on our shores here. But at the same time, I can't blame people for their interests and their tastes, and really being aware of all the bad things happening in the world is a bit of a burden and a bit of a downer, really, that I don't wish on anybody, and it's not for anybody. Sometimes I wish that I could just sort of get plugged back into the matrix and unsee some of the things I've seen and unknow some of the things I know. But I chose this path, and that's for me to deal with. But I can't fault people whose interests are in looking at cat videos or Kim Kardashian. Everybody has their interests, but I hope that when the time comes for people to support policies overseas in the interest of freedom and liberation for other people, that they'll think about where they come from in America, what our history is, and why they should support other people's desire for self-determination.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matthew VanDyke.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And good luck.
Yeah, is there anything else you may want to include that we may have skimmed over?
No, you guys covered a lot. Thank you for the interview.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate
everybody in Albany.
Yes, good luck with everything with Sons of Liberty, and we really appreciate you calling in. It was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night. So there you have it. That was Matthew VanDyke. I think we're going to transition to a PSA break. Just to remind you, you're listening to The Message with Muscavige and Murphy on WCDB Albany 90.9 FM. Stay tuned, guys.
The Message with Muscavige and Murphy is a 2-hour weekly radio program recorded live in the studios of WCDB Albany 90.9 FM. Since Nick and I are just getting started with producing our bonus material for podcasts, a reminder that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel through The Message on WCDB. And once again, thank you for listening to this edition of the show. and a very special thanks to both Patrick Tine and Matthew VanDyke for their contributions. And our fade out theme is called Space Hop, another production made possible by Marsh Sound. You can find the rest of his wonderful work on marshsound.bandcamp.com.